Ladies and gentlemen, would you please silence your phones if you haven't already? My name is Arthur Berger, and it's my pleasure to welcome Alan Holt, the Vice Chairman of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum.
Thank you, Arthur. Well, good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Museum Director, Sarah Bloomfield, Council Chairman Tom Bernstein, and the rest of the Holocaust Museum leadership, I want to welcome the diplomats from 35 countries, representatives from the United Nations, senior U.S. government officials, guests, and above all, Holocaust survivors. We gather here today and in places all over the world for the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. We are honored to have with us 30 survivors who volunteer at the museum. The survivors are the heart and soul of this institution and inspire all who meet them. I say this not only because I feel their inspiration every time I enter the museum, but also because my parents were survivors and they showed me by example to work for a better world. I'd also like to welcome the viewers joining today's ceremony online. By taking the time to mark this moment with us, you are making a commitment to remember the victims of the Holocaust and honor their memory. Whether you are in the museum or tuning in globally, we welcome you to join our conversation and share your reflections on the day using #HolocaustRemembrance. For 12 years since the United Nations General Assembly selected the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz as a day to remember the victims of the Holocaust, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has hosted this annual commemoration. Remembrance of the Holocaust is not just an event for Jews or the relatives of those murdered. It has great meaning for every citizen of the world, and the broad diplomatic representation here today sends a strong message to all who would deny the truth of the Holocaust. 2 years ago, Tom Bernstein, Sarah Bloomfield, and I hosted a delegation that traveled to Auschwitz to commemorate this date at the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. Today, we mark 72 years, and I assure you that many survivors, including my 97-year-old father, still vividly remember their experiences. Around the world today, many governments and United Nations offices are hosting special commemorations. In fact, Museum Director Sarah Bloomfield is in Paris, representing the museum for a special exhibition on Nazi propaganda. Highlights from this exhibition are also on display at the United Nations and in more than 40 UN information centers around the world. Through all of these events, we pledge that we are committing ourselves to better understand the past and do more to prevent future mass atrocities and genocide. However, we have not done enough to end mass murders, as was so recently evident in Syria and elsewhere. And by their presence, the Holocaust survivors here today serve as a powerful reminder of what unchecked hatred can bring even to so-called civilized societies. As part of today's program, Josie Traum will speak about the meaning of this day for her and other survivors. She and her husband, also a survivor, both volunteer at the museum, and Josie's mother, Fanny Eisenberg, a survivor of Auschwitz, still volunteers today at the age of 100. We are also especially pleased that Jacqueline Mendels Byrne, who survived the Holocaust with her parents and sister in France, will perform the mournful Ani Ma Amin, I believe. This prayer is based on Maimonides' 13 articles of faith and is recited in many prayer services, but most particularly during the high holidays. As they were being herded to their deaths in the gas chambers of the Nazi killing centers, many Jews sang this affirmation of their faith. The word Zachor, remember, is carved into the marble wall of this museum, as well into our psyche. If we remember the horrors of the Holocaust and how it was allowed to happen, perhaps we will learn to avoid future genocides. As part of our mission of remembrance, we must not forget the names of the victims of the Holocaust. Reading the names of the murdered victims of their relatives today are 7 young people who have committed themselves to teaching the history through their roles as docents in the museum's Bringing the Lessons Home Student Ambassador Program. These young adults are leaders of the future and play a special role in this museum and in the DC area community. Also today, museum volunteer Michael Margosis, who survived much of the Holocaust hiding with his family in France, will lead the Mourner's Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for the dead. And 2 members of the U.S. Army band, Martin Gold and Chad Leader, will then perform a recently discovered piece of music that emerged from survivors in post-World War II Sweden. Next, we will hear from Israeli Ambassador Ron Dermer. We are especially pleased that Ambassador Dermer has agreed to speak about the importance of Holocaust memory to Israel and the Jewish people. Ambassador Dermer served as a senior advisor to Prime Minister Netanyahu before becoming Israel's ambassador to the United States. I know Ambassador Dermer feels particularly close to Holocaust survivors who have had a great impact on his life. Ambassador Dermer.
Vice Chairman Holt, Ambassador Eisenstadt, Ambassador Lval, fellow diplomats, Israel's military attaché in Washington, Mickey Edelstein, and above all, the 30 survivors who are here today. 2 months ago, many of us in this remarkable museum met to remember a remarkable man, Elie Wiesel. We remembered his dignity, we remembered his humanity, and we remembered the courage of a man whose quiet voice was more powerful than the loudest thunder. But beyond his many virtues, one thing that always struck me about Elie Wiesel was that he was both a man of his people and a man of the world, and someone who understood, as precious few do, that the two actually go hand in hand. That lesson is particularly relevant to us on International Holocaust Remembrance Day. As many of you know, Israel remembers the Holocaust on a different day. That solemn day is linked to the Jewish calendar, to the 27th day of the Jewish month of Nisan, which every year falls sometime in April or May. On that day, sirens blare across the length and breadth of the one and only Jewish state. Cars stop on the road. People stand at attention. The nation of Israel remembers. These two separate memorial days, one marked by the world, one marked by Israel, speak to a challenge in remembering the Holocaust. For many, the Holocaust is primarily a universal story about man's inhumanity to man, about the evils of racism and xenophobia, about how even the most enlightened societies can descend into darkness and barbarism. Seeing the Holocaust in this way no doubt makes it resonate farther and wider. It connects the victims of the Holocaust to the victims of other horrific evils, from Rwanda to Darfur to Aleppo. It enables every child, whether from China or Chile, black or white, Christian or Muslim, to appreciate that the Holocaust has meaning for them as well. No doubt, many who share this universal view of the Holocaust believe they honor its victims. They believe that in standing in solidarity with all peoples, they reject a world that did not stand in solidarity with the Jewish people in our hour of need. This is a noble vision anchored in the highest ideals. But if this universal vision is not firmly rooted in an appreciation that the Holocaust is first and foremost a Jewish story, it can become not only dangerous, but even immoral. Dangerous because the Holocaust was a unique eruption of a unique hatred that goes well beyond the appalling savageries rooted in prejudice that have claimed countless lives across time and space. The uniqueness of the Holocaust, as opposed to genocide, mass murder, or other unforgivable atrocities, can be seen in various corners throughout this museum. It can be seen in the targeting of all Jews for extermination, in the systematic planning and execution of that goal, in the Holocaust being an end in itself rather than a means to an end, and in so many other ways. So too, anti-Semitism is unique among hatreds. The evidence of that uniqueness is not only in its longevity, ubiquity, and ferocity, but perhaps above all, in its malleability. Long ago, anti-Semitism won the Darwinian contest of hatreds. It is the survival of the basest. It is the hatred that has proven most adaptable across civilizations and cultures. It is the pathology that has proven most compatible to different identities and different ideologies. And if universalizing the Holocaust means ignoring the uniqueness of those crimes and the uniqueness of the hatred that led to them, then the Jewish people will have dangerously forgotten the most important lesson of the Holocaust. That lesson is the need for the Jewish people to never be powerless against their enemies, to never rely on others to defend us. That is the lesson that the leaders of Israel and the people of Israel know well. It is why the most sacrosanct principle of my country's statecraft is to ensure that we are always able to defend ourselves by ourselves against any threat. It is why Israel will never allow those who seek our destruction to develop the means to achieve that goal, regardless of what deals are made by the international community. And is why Prime Minister Netanyahu said yesterday at Yad Vashem that it is his job to ensure that we never need institutions like Yad Vashem. But ladies and gentlemen, a universalized Holocaust, unmoored from its Jewish anchor, is more than dangerous. It is also immoral. Immoral because the Holocaust took everything from its Jewish victims. It took their homes and their valuables. It took their freedom and their dignity. It took their lives and their future. We must not compound the unimaginable crimes of the past by perpetrating an unspeakable crime in the present. After the Holocaust took away so much from the Jews, we must not take the Holocaust itself away from the Jews. That would be an unforgivable betrayal of the memory of 6 million Jews, of the memory of 1.5 million Jewish children. These victims were murdered not merely because they were different. They were murdered not merely because they were an other. They were murdered because they were Jews. Elie Wiesel, the greatest witness to that murder, understood that well. Some 30 years ago, in a ceremony in which he received the Congressional Gold Medal, Elie Wiesel said, quote, "I have learned that the Holocaust was a unique and uniquely Jewish event, albeit with universal implications. Not all victims were Jews, but all Jews were victims." Ladies and gentlemen, the fact that Elie understood that the Holocaust was first and foremost about the Jews did not prevent him from fighting for the rights of all. On the contrary, it was precisely because he understood the unique crime that had been perpetrated against his own people that Elie became such a powerful and effective advocate for all peoples. That is something that we should remember, especially today, on International Holocaust Remembrance Day. We should remember a unique hatred that resulted in a unique crime against the Jewish people, and empowered by the memory of a unique crime that happened to our people, we should recommit ourselves to standing up for all peoples. Yehi zichram baruch. May their memory be blessed.
Thank you, Ambassador Dermer, for your very moving remarks. The street on which this museum sits, Raoul Wallenberg Place, continuously reminds us of the courageous Swedish businessman, diplomat, and humanitarian who was posted to Nazi-occupied Budapest in July 1944 following the call for help by the American War Refugee Board. He, along with other diplomats, issued protective letters that saved the lives of many tens of thousands of Jews. Wallenberg's legacy is an example of a common humanitarian understanding between Sweden, the United States, and the rest of the world. As Sweden's ambassador to the United States, Bjorn Lyrvall helps to strengthen this nation's relationship with the United States. 17 years ago, Sweden hosted the International Forum on the Holocaust, where 46 nations adopted the Stockholm Declaration, committing their governments to teach the history, remember the victims, and open their archives for more accurate research on the Holocaust. It is now my pleasure to invite Ambassador Lyrvall to speak on the importance of the Holocaust to Sweden as well as Europe.
Vice Chair Holt, Ambassador Dermer, fellow ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed survivors. I would like to begin by thanking the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and in particular my friend Arthur Berger, for inviting me to speak here today. It's a true honor, it's a privilege to be here with you. Today, we observe the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Our thoughts and our prayers go to the millions of victims, to the survivors, and to their families marked by scars for life by the horrors of the Holocaust. We are all grateful for the survivors being here with us today. And we are thankful for your willingness to continue to speak out, to share your stories, and to help us understand. We cannot build a future without understanding the past. I remember the first time I myself met a survivor of the Holocaust. The story that she told of the unspeakable horrors, the pain, the loss, the suffering, but also the hope, compassion, and courage, that all stayed with me. And I still remember, I still recall, and I can still recount that meeting. I have shared her story with my children because I owe it, not only to them, but also to you to remember. Because it's our obligation to remember. And even though it is impossible, and because at times unbearable, we owe it to the victims to try to understand. And we have a collective duty to make sure that nothing like the Holocaust ever happens again. Based on our common humanity, we need to stand up against intolerance and hatred. Based on our conviction that everyone should enjoy the same rights regardless of race, color, sex, religion, or origin, we need to act when those rights are violated. One person who did just that was a fellow diplomat in the Swedish Foreign Service, Raoul Wallenberg, who more than 70 years ago was arrested by Soviet troops in Budapest, never to be seen again. Raoul Wallenberg, at the time on mission in Budapest, 1944 to 1945, he acted in real time with bravery, determination, ingenuity, and compassion to save as many Hungarian Jews as he could, close to 100,000, sometimes defying instructions from his superiors. He was only 32 years old, but he showed that one person can actually make a difference, setting example for generations of diplomats and civil servants like myself to come. Raoul Wallenberg, he came from a family of great wealth and influence. He could have remained safely in neutral Sweden during the World War II. Instead, as first secretary at the Swedish legation in Budapest, he acted without concerns for his own safety to save tens of thousands from a certain death at the hands of the Nazis. Of course, Wallenberg was not alone in taking such action. Others choose to risk their careers and their lives to defy official protocols and repressive laws to rescue Jews. Many were censured, punished, or killed for their acts of courage. And as a result, at Yad Vashem in Israel, you will find planted along the Avenue of the Righteous not only Raoul Wallenberg's tree, but also the trees of 2,000 others, as well as 18,000 names engraved in the walls in remembrance of those who risked their lives to save Jews from the Holocaust. Why did they do it? All of these heroes seem to have shared the sentiment of the Lutheran pastor and Nazi resistor Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who wrote, "Silence in the face of evil is evil itself. Not to act is to act. Not to act is to act." These words ring true still today. Never again, we said after the war, and we made progress. The international rules-based order was reinforced with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a cornerstone. Respect for equal and inalienable rights was enshrined and enforced globally. But in parts of the world, the scourge of anti-Semitism is again showing its ugly face. We are witnessing an increase in intolerance and hatred in Europe and in other parts of the world, on the internet, in social media, in the streets, and around religious institutions. Sweden is not spared. When a Jewish boy is too afraid to wear his yarmulke on the subway in Stockholm, or when a rabbi in Malmö is assaulted, we must act. Through support to the Jewish community in Sweden, through education, and through an unyielding commitment to counter all forms of anti-Semitism, we must make sure that such hatred is never accepted in a democracy. Sweden has a tradition of taking in people fleeing from war, injustice, and persecution. Well, during the war in October 1943, Sweden provided the refuge for almost the entire Jewish population of Denmark. In 2015, more than 160,000 people, not all of them refugees, came to Sweden. That was an increase of our population of almost 2% in 1 year. Some came from countries where anti-Semitism is part of the state narrative. That means that we have to be even more persistent in explaining and defending the rights, obligations, and values that underpin not only our society, but all democracies. Ladies and gentlemen, my memory brings me back to the chaotic last days of the Soviet Union, to the end of 1991, when I served as a young diplomat in Moscow. I was asked to join the investigation into the fate of Raoul Wallenberg, and as the KGB stronghold of the archives loosened, we thought time had come to find the truth about what actually happened half a century before. There had been decades of failed studies and investigations, periods when, due to a regrettable lack of commitment by my government, Raoul Wallenberg almost faded into obscurity, but was rescued by a strong international, not least American voice, recalling his legacy. We worked tirelessly in diplomatic, military, and security service archives in Moscow for months and surveyed thousands of documents. In addition, I was part of a small Swedish-Russian group knocking on doors of surviving KGB personnel who at the end of the war had been part of Stalin's security apparatus and possibly could have met with Wallenberg. We tracked down the one surviving KGB officer who, according to archive material, twice in 1946 and 1947 had interrogated Raoul. His memory of these horrifying years was excellent, but as we closed in on the fate of Raoul Wallenberg, his statements became increasingly bland and foggy. Perhaps this old man, who at the end of the war was nothing but a junior operator, did not want to be the one seen as responsible for revealing the secret of what happened. Perhaps forever to be associated with the crime of Communist Soviet Union crushing the man who had actively fought Nazis and saved Jews in Budapest. We will probably never know for sure, but even as it seems, Stalin killed Raoul Wallenberg in the Soviet Union in 1947. Raoul's deeds and his example live on forever. And even if it's hard, we must find the words to keep on telling the story of the unspeakable horrors of the Holocaust and to keep his history part of today. We must never forget. And we must tell the stories of human beings who made a difference, like Raoul Wallenberg. To remember his determination to do the right thing is also a way of keeping history alive, and it gives us courage. Not to act is to act. Let us therefore forever be vigilant to detect the first signs of hatred and intolerance in our communities, and forever vigorous in confronting them. Let us educate our children to defend and respect one another and prevent such inhumanity in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Lyrvall, for these stirring remarks. It's appropriate for all of us, as you said and as Ambassador Dermer did, to remember the Holocaust because it is so significant in each of our lives. even if we weren't personally affected, even if our families weren't affected. We have to think of the future by remembering the past. Let me now welcome Josie Traum, a survivor of the Holocaust, a volunteer at the museum, to give her reflections on her life. Josie.
Thank you. Ladies, excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I feel very, very lucky. I'm just start crying. I feel very lucky to be here. I feel very lucky to be alive and to have survived. So I feel very lucky also that I was born in Belgium, which was really very kind and helpful to its Jews. I feel very lucky, as I said, that I was born in Belgium, but I also feel very lucky to be born to my mother, who really was a very brave woman and had to make many decisions which must have been so very difficult. So let me tell you a little bit about my early life. My parents, who were living in Belgium, were married in 1938. They were a newly married couple. Everything was going very well for them. They were working. Things were good. In 1939, a year later, I was born. And things had not begun yet, although they did begin very soon after. World War II began in 1940. I was born a few months before the beginning of the war, which was September 1939. It was really rumored in Belgium, in the Jewish community, that when the Germans would enter Belgium, they would leave the women and children alone and only arrest the men. My parents were listening to the radio all the time, especially to the BBC, where people were actually, the British were asking people to volunteer to be in the British Army. My father obviously thought that my mom and I would be okay, so he and his brother decided to volunteer in the British Army. They actually took one of the last ships that was able to cross the English Channel in 1940, because afterwards the Germans began torpedoing ships that were crossing the channel. So my dad and his brother, who were both tailors, went to Britain and decided to volunteer. The British took a look at them, these two tailors, and said, we'll put them in a factory making British uniforms. Best place that my dad and my uncle could be. My mother and I was 13 months old, by the way, when my dad did leave for Britain. My mom and I and her parents, my maternal grandparents, lived together in an attic apartment, very much to ourselves, did not go out very much. My mother was part of the underground. She would let Jews sleep in our apartment until they found a safer place where the Germans weren't yet, maybe Switzerland or Portugal. And so she was part of the underground. Because she was part of the underground, she asked the people in the underground to take me away and to put me into hiding. She had the connections and she could do that. So one day in 1942, I was 3 years old. Two strange ladies came to my mom's apartment to pick me up. I had no idea what was going on. I was 3 years old. I didn't even know what a Jew was, to differentiate from me and from anybody else. My mother, by the way, was not allowed to know where they were putting me. It was thought that when the Germans would come to an apartment and ask the people, where's the rest of your family? Where's your husband? Where are your children? That they would tell. So the underground movement decided not to tell parents where their children were being kept. And I just think to myself how horrible and difficult that must have been for my mother to make that decision, not to know where I was going, not to know even if she'll ever see me again. These two ladies took me to Bruges, which is a beautiful little city in Belgium, full of convents and full of canals. It's like the Venice of Belgium. They took me to a convent in Bruges and left me there. The nuns were very, very, very strict. The convent was full of children, and unbeknownst to me, and I found this out after the war, there were 3 other Jewish children there. So we were 4 Jewish kids all together. The other children were Belgian children. Because it was time of war, people didn't have enough food to feed their children, so they would put them in a convent, which was more like an orphanage. So this orphanage was full of children. And if people were able, sometimes in the future, to manage, they would pick up their children. But of course, that didn't really happen. I had been there at the convent for 6 months. By the way, I mean to say also, the nuns were very, very strict. But they were strict with me, not because I was Jewish. They were strict to all the kids. And I've learned from doing tours, especially with many Catholic people, they say, oh yeah, we remember. The nuns are usually very, very strict. Anyhow, the nuns found out that after being there for 6 months, that the Germans were going to come and pick up the 4 Jewish children. The nuns by night smuggled the 4 of us out and took us back to Brussels, which is actually where I was from and where I was born. The nuns were really risking their lives, first of all by taking us in and by even smuggling us out. If you were caught hiding a Jew, the Germans would just shoot you on the street, no questions asked. So these nuns smuggled us out and got us back to Brussels and placed me with a Christian family, a mother, a father, and a little girl my age. These people were Christian people. The man was part of the underground. They would often take him out and interrogate him at night, and he would come back in the morning, black and blue. They would actually beat him. He never told on me. And so I stayed with them actually until the end of the war. You know, in Belgium, food was rationed, and you would go pick up the food for how many people were registered in your family. They had 3 people registered. I was there illegally. So they got food for 3 people, and they always shared it with me. So, you know, these people were risking their lives, as were the nuns. So I'm really grateful that I was in Belgium. And by the way, in the meantime, while I was taken to the convent, my mother and her parents were deported. They were taken to Auschwitz. The Jews from Belgium were always taken to Auschwitz rather than other camps. Now, Auschwitz, most concentration camps were killing centers. You got there and they killed you. Auschwitz had a sub-camp, Birkenau, which had a labor camp where they made ammunition. And my mother and her parents were in the train for about 4 days and 4 nights. Depending on how far the country was where you were coming from to the concentration camp, you would be there on that train that many days. By the time the train got to Auschwitz, 40 or so, there were usually 100 or 150 passengers, prisoners on the train. By the time they got to Auschwitz, about 40 or 50 people were already dead. My grandfather died on one of the trains. As soon as my mother and her mother got off the train, there was a selection. People were put on one side if they were young enough, who could work labor in the factory, and if you were too old or holding a child, they would put you on the other side, and you would not really remain. They would kill you immediately. The prisoners who get off the train, there were barking dogs with guards making sure you would stay in your line. My mother and her mother were separated immediately. My mother was young. She must have been maybe 24, 25. My grandmother was an old lady. She was 50 years old. So they separated them immediately, and my mother actually never saw her mother again. She tried to be in the line with her mother, and she went there, but the Nazi actually swiped her and hit her and said, "You go where you belong." My mother remained in Auschwitz until the liberation. She was liberated by the Russians in 1945. She was very, very sick. She had typhus and meningitis, and the Russians actually put her in a hospital. She weighed about 65 pounds. And eventually she made her way back to Brussels. In the meantime, my mother had two sisters, my two aunts, who were all hidden in churches in Belgium through the underground. Because there was a whole network of the underground, people knew how to find each other. So my two aunts knew how to find me. They went to the underground, they found where I was, and they picked me up and brought me to their house. And I stayed with them from liberation, which in Belgium was liberated in 1944, till the end of the war. And my mother eventually made her way down, and she right away went to her sister's house and knocked on the door, and there I was. So we were reunited. Luckily, we were reunited, and my father came back not till 2 years later. While he was living in London, his house was bombed, and he spent 2 years in jail. Excuse me, not in jail, in a hospital. He eventually did come back. I was 6 years old. I really didn't recognize him. I didn't know who he was, and it was very difficult, as you can imagine, readjusting to a family. My dad, who wasn't used to kids, he left me when I was 13 months old, and my parents decided to leave Europe. They'd had enough, and it was really difficult. They lost so many members of their family. So they decided to make applications and papers, and in 1949, we arrived in the United States. And we went to North New Jersey because my mom had an elderly aunt, and you usually move where you have a relative. So we stayed with her for a month until my parents found an apartment, found jobs, and we've been here ever since. And I'm really, really very lucky to be here. I had a career as a social worker, and when I retired, I came here. This museum is so important. It tells my story, it tells all of our stories, and it's such an important place to be. I do law enforcement tours. I tour with the police, with the FBI, ICE, all law enforcement. And it's really wonderful that this museum is such an educational tool. It educates people of what happened, because we should never let it happen again. People need to know what happened as part of history. And I go to schools, I speak to schools in all the counties around. And I must say, to end my story right now, I want to say in the words of Elie Wiesel that the opposite of love is not hate, but it's indifference. And we have to speak up when we see injustice or people being hurt. We need to speak up. People spoke up for me, and that's why I'm here today. It's very fortunate many people did speak up, but many did not. My mother's neighbor actually denounced her because the Germans gave people money to tell them where the Jews were hiding. So there were wonderful people, and I wonder what makes the difference, what makes a person be able to risk their life and one person do just the opposite. Thank you.
Thank you, Josie. You spoke from the heart, and the heart of all of the survivors who are with us. And we thank you for sharing that with us. Ani Maamin, as Alan explained, is a very important prayer, and especially important to those who were victimized, because so many sang this prayer of belief as they were being marched to their death. Jacqueline Mendelssohn, a survivor herself, will perform this beautiful melody. Thank you. Thank you, Jacqueline. And Jacqueline was accompanied by George Waltemir of the U.S. Army Band. Every year, on the Day of Remembrance of the Holocaust, on Yom HaShoah, we read the names of the victims. Today, we are proud that 7 young people who volunteer at the museum, docents, what we call them the Bringing Home the Lessons student ambassadors from the Washington area, will be reading the names of the relatives of the survivors who are here with us today. It's a very meaningful thing that they are doing. We thank Gianna Asomani Graham, Takai Campbell Gross, Raquel Donnelly, Caitlin Fleming, Michaela Hall, Sharon Mazo, and Ella Vidalia.
Once again, good morning, everyone. The Bringing the Lessons Home program has the blessed privilege to partake in the International Holocaust Remembrance Day commemoration. My name, like was stated, is Gianna Asomani Graham, and I will now read the names. Olga Schreiber, Irka K, Regina Schreiber, Leah Fogel, Meyer Fogel, Moesh Fogel, Tehekla Mendels, Bernard Mendels, Anthea Mendoz. Bertha Friedman, Aura Friedman, Esther Friedman, Hilda Strauss, Hoda Bermer, Anna Knoll, Heinrich Knoll, Jacob Wise, and Charles Perstein.
Hello, my name is Ella Videgla, and I will be reading the following names. Shmuel Karpik, Rosa Tashnovitz Karpik, Clara Eisen, Sala Weinstock, Herman Weinstock, Fanya Rickman, Joseph Rickman, Manya Koplin, Meyer Koplin.
My name is Michaela Hall. I'll be reading the following names. Rachel Men, Mosia Men, Stash Men, Joel Men, Jacina Wellerman, Gompertz, Eddie Gompertz, Astrid Gompertz, Asyash Gruber, Sarah Gruber, Rivka Gruber, Isaac Drummer.
Hello, my name is Takaya Cameron Gross, and I'll be reading the following names. Hannah Wise, Esther Wise, Miriam Wise, Moshe Wise, Golda Wise, Esther Spitzer, Malka Spitzer, Joseph Wax, and David Wax.
My name is Carla Mejia, and I'll be reading the following names. Eva Munzer, Leah Munzer, Simha Munzer, Hermosa Benederet, Esther Toledano, Erna Friedlander, Sigmund Friedlander, and Vera Friedlander.
My name is Raquel Donnelly, and I'll be reading the following names. Arpad Grunwald, Laszlo Grunwald, Imre Grunwald, Abraham David Lifshitz, Wolf Mirbaum, Sarah Mirbaum, Sammy Mirbaum, Ida Mirbaum, Esther Mirbaum, and Leah Mirbaum.
My name is Sharon Mazzo, and I will be reading the following names. Vas Miklosh, Lieberman Miklosh, Foldes Mocha, Lieberman Ershi, Shushika Ershi, Feda Fenster, Itzchak Ruben Fenster, Naftali Fenster, Sindela Sarah Fenster, and the Zucker family.
Thank you. These young people have made a commitment to memory and to teach. And they are our next generation, which is a very important statement that they make. Michelle Margosas. Michelle Margosas, a survivor from Belgium, who volunteers at the museum, will lead us in the Kaddish, which will be followed by a moment of silence. Michelle, please rise.
Vizkadash, Shmei Rabba, Be'alma Nivra Kirutei, Be'amnich Malchutei, Dechayechon Uyemechon, Uchaye Dechol Beit Israel, Bagala Uyuzman Kori Ve'imru Amen. Yahei Shmei Rabba Mvorach, De'olam Olmei Yomaya, Ve'ishbarach, Ve'ishtabach, Ve'ishrapar, Ve'isroman, Ve'isnaseh, Ve'sadar, Ve'saleh, Ve'salal, Shmei Kodeshah Brichu. Leila min kol bichata, v'shirata, tushperata, v'nemechata, da'miron bi'alma v'imru, Amen. Yehei shlam rabba mim shemaya, v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Israel v'imru, Amen. עושה שלום במרומה, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן. That's it.
Thank you, Michelle. You may be seated. We will now hear a piece of music that, as far as we know, has never been performed before in the United States. Martin Gold on the clarinet and George Waltermeyer on the guitar from the U.S. Army Band will be performing the music of Ichzuk and Eitzah, I'm Looking for Advice. The song was created in the Krakow ghetto, one of only a few surviving works by a gifted young composer, Yaakov Weingarten, who with his wife and 3-year-old daughter were murdered during a deportation from a village near Krakow in 1942. Like most of Weingarten's music, this song and many others might have been lost to us. However, at the end of the Second World War, Holocaust survivors in Stockholm, collected together with the cantor of the Stockholm Great Synagogue, Leo Rosenbluth, who then published this song in an important book of Yiddish and Holocaust songs. The songbook recently was made as a gift to this museum from the Jewish Community Center of Stockholm and now has an important place in our library's collections. Weingarten set this music to the story of a poem, Yiddish poem written by Moshe Schimmel, who also perished in Lval in 1942. I'd like to just read you a translation of his poem because it is such an important piece of work. I seek advice like someone dangerously ill. I want to flee before the doom. I seek a kinship with grasses and with snow. Perhaps I will yet come back as them, but nothing helps me. I cry out, it hurts. I fall upon the earth with longing and with joy. In her I seek a likeness to myself, but she is great and smells of eternity. I feel the walls, I feel the table and the bench. Nothing helps me. I am dangerously ill. At night my doom is lurking before me. It shames me to reveal this. I blush with shame to write this poem because I really do fear death. Following the playing of this tune, we will ask everyone to please rise. Ambassadors will be led together with Holocaust survivors to light memorial candles, followed by everyone else who is in attendance. Thank you. That was a beautiful tune, and as I said, this is the first time, to our knowledge, that it's been performed in the United States at a very appropriate occasion. I would like to ask everyone to please rise, and you'll be guided with survivors, ambassadors.